Okay, this is great. We've had a little bit of a day in the office because our Wi-Fi cut out, so I had to come home. So here I am. But at
By
least
the
I have
way, Elizabeth, are we thanking the American Irish Historical Society or the Irish American Heritage Museum or both?
both. It's a
Oh, okay,
joint. Yeah. hmm
gotcha.
So very happy to be representing both. So that's great. We might as well start because I see we have a good few people already coming in, and I am that little bit late. Delighted to have with us tonight Robert Polner and Michael Tubridy, who are the co-authors of An Irish Passion for Justice, which was just recently published by Cornell University Press and tells an enthralling and inspiring New York immigrant story, of course, about Paul O'Dwyer and how one person shaped by history and community can make a difference in the world by holding true to their own ideals. He was a passionate man, a kind of a man with wide-ranging interests, I would say. And as the authors have said, he was a man of his time, but also a politician beyond his own years. Um, Robert Polner has reported exclusively or extensively, sorry, for Newsday, the New York Daily News, and other newspapers, and he's public affairs officer with NYU. He has also co-written and edited 4 other books, including The Man Who Saved New York, which was a 2010 chronicle about Governor Hugh Carey, and the 1975 New York fiscal crisis, which actually won the Empire State History Book Award. Michael Tubridy then is a researcher, editor, and freelance writer whose work has appeared in Irish America, The Recorder, Kirkus Reviews, and other publications. He has Irish roots on both sides of his family, and he writes and lectures on Irish and Irish American literature, film, and history. And he has a blog called A Boat Against the Current. So check that out, everybody. We are, as the guys alluded to, we're live streaming onto the Irish American Heritage Museum's YouTube channel, but we are also here with the American Irish Historical Society, of which I'm now the executive director. So, guys, thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us. And I'll just start us off by asking what drew you both to Paul O'Dwyer?
Well, Elizabeth, first of all, let me thank you on my behalf, and I think on Michael Tubridy's behalf for certain, for having us today to talk with you about our book and the Irish American Heritage Museum and the American Irish Historical Society. So it's really lovely to be here. We thank you very much.
Great.
Um, I myself had never met Paul O'Dwyer, but in my kind of Cook's tour of New York City tabloid newsrooms in my former career as a reporter, I met a number of people who were his friends. These included columnists as well as reporters who Paul had aided in one way or another on one story or another over the years, whether that was Jimmy Brislin or Pete Hamill or Murray Kempton, who were all who I crossed paths with at
Mhm.
one time or another and benefited from knowing them. Um, yeah, so I was attracted to Paul based on my interest in New York City affairs, New York City politics, and additionally my interest in kind of diaspora politics. Paul was a great example of someone who felt very strongly that in a way he lived in two worlds. Although he left Ireland as a young man, he never lost his connection to his homeland. And as we can talk about later, he became deeply engaged as an older man in the troubles in Northern Ireland.
And for my part, like Rob, I never had the occasion to meet Paul Dwyer, but I really felt a sense of affinity to him through the Irish roots that you alluded to before on both sides of the family. My father was a native of County Clare, which is about a 2-hour drive from where Paul grew up in County Mayo. Also a rural community like that. And in addition, my grandfather on my mother's side happened to belong to the Transport Workers Union, whose head was Michael Quill, who happened to be a client and good friend of Paul's. So I think certainly from both of those points of view, I felt a real affinity for O'Dwyer. And in addition to that, just growing up in the 1970s in the Irish American community, when there was a great deal of interest and certainly news articles and attention coming out about the troubles in Northern Ireland, Paul was really a ubiquitous presence at that point, representing the move for justice and really reunification in Ireland. So I think from both of those points of view, that really drew me to the project.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to start at the beginning, I suppose, can you speak to how his growing up in a small town in County Mayo, you know, like what impacted him there in his childhood that he carried with him, or that maybe influenced his activism? You know, obviously coming to New York from a small Mayo village is a big change, you know, even though he had family here too, of course. But was there something about his childhood in rural Ireland that inspired him, or, you know, did he reinvent himself when he came to New York?
I think both were true. Mike, I'll start with this and then I'll ask you if you can, you might want to add to it. Mike alluded to Michael Quill, the great founder, one of the founders of the Transport Workers Union here in New York, who represented transit workers who at the time were very poorly paid. And there was a large complement of Irish Americans in that workforce. Paul is younger than Michael Quill, and maybe in a sense, the tail end of a generation that was conditioned by their experience growing up and observing the events after World War I of the Irish War of Independence. That kind of set the stage for Paul, who is an astute and sensitive and observant young man in a rural hamlet in the west of Ireland, to really a lifetime of activism. He doesn't reach the United States until he's age 17. Four of his brothers are here. One of them, of course, Bill O'Dwyer, would eventually become the mayor of New York City. That's a whole other aspect of Paul's life and career. But in his native Ireland, his family was, you know, anti-British government, opposed to a free state arrangement. And his home was used, he was the youngest, by the way, of 11 children, 10 of whom grew to maturity. And a number of his brothers still in Ireland at that point were rebels in the hills fighting the British and the Black and Tans, who your listeners will know about, I'm sure. British recruits who were rampaging through the countryside during Paul's youth. And his home was used as a kind of safe house. There were safe houses all over for people volunteers like Michael Quill, I guess, who was in a different part of Ireland, but who were fighting and needed a place to rest or hide from the Black and Tans and from British security apparatus. The British seeking to suppress, once again, the impulse and the drive for independence. So Paul was very strongly, I would say, affected by his growing up years in that environment, and never really turned back from it.
And just picking up on what Rob was saying on the Black and Tans, I think his eyewitness to their deprivations really ended up fundamentally influencing how he perceived events in the United States and even arguably elsewhere in the world. First, he went on record later on in his life as saying, in terms of what was happening with civil rights in the American South in the 1950s and 60s, that what activists were experiencing in terms of being denied the right to vote by terror was just like what the Black and Tans were inflicting in Ireland. So I think from that point of view, there certainly was an influence. The second aspect of it was an anti-colonial streak that manifested itself elsewhere later on in his life. And again, I'm thinking in this case of Israel, where Paul aided the Israeli drive for independence in the late 1940s. And he really saw that movement against British occupying force as analogous to what was happening in Ireland. So I think certainly from those points of view that that fundamentally influenced how he saw events in the United States and internationally.
And I think how he lived his life as well. So, as I said, he decided at age 17, he follows the sort of natural or unnatural flow of emigration to New York. Gets a letter from his older brother, Frank, one of four brothers already in New York, working kind of in a working class city. They're working on the waterfront. Bill had been a cop, now was finishing up the requirements for becoming a lawyer. Another brother was was soon to be a fireman, and yet another brother was working at downtown at a produce market. So they greet him at the docks in 1925. That's the Jazz Age, right? Mm-hmm. And although that's what wasn't called at the time, I don't think later would be dubbed the Jazz Age. But Paul doesn't really experience New York in that way, in an F. Scott Fitzgerald sort of way. He experiences as a place where you go to work, and he got a place in an Irish rooming house on the Upper West Side, and he decides to go to law school, and he ends up pretty soon working on the docks through his brother Jack mainly, and then going to law school at St. John's University, which is very new. It was in Brooklyn, and it had a very large number, by the way, of Jewish students. So it was a law school for the children of immigrants. It wasn't Columbia. It wasn't even Fordham, which was more expensive. And that's where Paul made a lot of friends and got his law education. And very early on, after graduating and passing the bar, he passes the bar even before he becomes a citizen by way of a waiver from Benjamin Cardoza. Is that right?
Yes.
Through the interventions in part of his brother, who circulates a petition, gives it to the great judge, who says, go ahead and take the bar, even though you're shy of getting your citizenship. It was that kind of arrangement. He was a bright young guy, and he would start working for the lawyer Oscar Bernstein in Brooklyn, who he would eventually become partners with, who is a Russian Jewish man of about 20 years his senior, and his mentor and his role model. But the point I'm getting to is that Paul brought that sensibility we were describing of wanting to defend the underdog, and in particularly the constitutional rights of the underdog, no matter his or her political stripes or point of view. Mm. And he jumps in pretty early on at the defense table for a man named Ben Gold, who's the leading communist radical unionist. Was with the Leather Workers Union in the Garment District, and a case brought against that union by the federal government, and a kind of Sherman antitrust case, an unusual application of that law to rein in business monopolies against a union. And so Paul, from the start, is defending the rights of of a radical who was a communist during the Great Depression, at the risk of being called one himself, which would later become a greater risk, as the Cold War tensions would heat up. He did not seem to mind that. He embraced the idea that in America, as in Ireland, people should be able to associate with whatever political party or political group they wanted to, say whatever, be as radical as they want without fear of state suppression.
So it kind of seems, and I could be coming at this wrong, but he comes to New York when, in one way, you could argue Irish America is kind of on the decline a little bit. We've had the Johnson-Reed Act, which in one way preserved that quota system. So because the Irish were already in such great numbers, we weren't limited as such. But Tammany Hall is certainly starting to kind of change over. There's internal kind of problems between the groups themselves. You've got the LaGuardia, we'll call it, faction, and all those other, FDR, where Democrats are not necessarily agreeing. And there's a book called A Stripe of Tammany Tiger, I think, which talks about like the Jewish uprising within the party. So you could argue that really, it wasn't so much that he was representative of Irish America, but he was representative of almost a Jewish New York, or some kind of new working class melting pot New York,
Yeah, I think absolutely you're right. He is coming over. It's not quite the sort of wrenching transition of the 1950s when many Irish Americans are going out to the suburbs, and their time as a political force in the city is being diluted. But there certainly is an element where Tammany is trying to adjust to forces from within, from new immigration groups, like I guess Jewish people from Eastern Europe, for instance, and Italians, and they're trying to figure out how to structure tickets. The other aspect of this, I guess, the year before Paul came over, 1924, I guess the longtime head of Tammany Hall in New York, Charlie Murphy, passed away. And Charlie Murphy had been really pretty instrumental in bringing along young talent like Robert Wagner and Al Smith, who were absolutely instrumental in passing social welfare legislation following the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. So yeah, there is an element in that where I guess it's not quite as much as it's going to be later, but Tammany is certainly feeling the tremors, and even I guess Fiorello LaGuardia is also getting his start, and within a decade he's going to pose a direct challenge to them.
And I think, Elizabeth, Paul was an Irishman, of course, but he was a New Yorker, and he was a pluralistic person, as was his brother Bill, a liberal, pluralistic, New Deal kind of American. And whereas some of his fellow Irish might have not been as open, maybe, to working with Jewish people, let's say, or becoming their friends, Paul really admired them. And that started during law school, when he made a lot of friends who were Jewish at St. John's. He describes a number of his experiences in his own memoir with some of his Jewish friends in their initial forays into Tammany Hall districts and politics, where their idealism was very quickly shut down. Because Tammany was a transactional party, and even figures like Charlie Murphy were acting, in a sense, to preserve the strength of the party by opening it to the whole raft of Jewish immigrants and then Italian immigrants. So they were, we might call them progressive today. I don't know if they would have thought of themselves that way, but that is what happened. And Paul brought that same spirit to his own ideas about the Democratic Party, because remember, he was a Democrat. May have been viewed by some of his more conservative Irish friends as a radical or a lefty, but he was a Democrat, capital D, and he felt that throughout his life that the party should be opening their doors to excluded groups or minorities in particular, whether they were, you know, African Americans, Latino Americans, or gays later on. And, you know, interestingly, one of the many, many legal battles he was involved with, because remember, he's a figure at the barricades in the courts and in politics. It's kind of interesting. Very strikingly consistent in his sort of views about constitutional liberties and in his liberalism and in his pluralism throughout his life, even after he became somewhat successful as a lawyer who did torts work and discrimination work. But he had a strong civil liberties streak in him. You know, Paul really embraced this idea of an open, a dynamic party, and he kind of lived his life that way.
Well, so yeah, to bring us on then to, you know, I mean, all through the 30s, Father Coughlin, and then of course you're coming up to McCarthy, to unfortunately Irish American voices, you know, that were very anti-communist, and he butts heads in that arena too. Can you talk to us about his defense of labor and or communism?
Well, an interesting part of his early career in politics, his first race is in 1948, largely centered in the Inwood section of northern Manhattan, which then had a very sizable Irish community as well as a sizable Jewish community, and they kind of occupied two sides of Broadway up there. And the race in 48 was against Jacob Javits, who was a moderate Republican, liberal, we could call a liberal Republican. So it was a tough race. And his brother, remember, was at City Hall. The waters of the Cold War are rising all around Bill, who was somewhat reluctant to very forcefully embrace his brother's positions. And while he endorses Paul, he does so very late in the game and a certain amount of arm's length, because this was now a minefield by 1948 in politics. Any hint that you had any sympathy for someone who might have sympathy for the rights of communists to express themselves in politics, which of course Paul absolutely supported and had the endorsement of the American Labor Party, as well as the Democratic Party in that race. But, you know, what made you guilty until proven innocent or something like that. Yeah. But Paul, you know, he ran a close race against the more popular Javits with Jewish support, which Javits, who was Jewish, also had, and with Irish support, but also being labeled Pink Paul in his campaign stops, basically a communist. And he had to defend himself against those kind of attacks during that race, which came from Irish people. And it hurt him, and it hurt his chances, but he came surprisingly close to winning the election on the same.
The other kind of a strain in this situation derived, I think, from what was happening with the Catholic Church from really certainly the 1930s into the 1940s, and how it viewed communism. Just remember in the 1930s that with the Spanish Civil War, that the church is in an adversarial position vis-a-vis the loyalist government that comes in Spain in 1936. And certainly there's a traditional suspicion of communism that governs during this time. That does carry over to people like you mentioned Father Coughlin and Joseph McCarthy later on. And so I think a lot of, as Rob indicated, Paul's willingness to defend the rights of people that were branded communists really fed into accusations against him in certainly the 1948 election. And he did parry that, I think, pretty well at one point, you know, where he actually issued a statement to the effect that because of people would be surprised because of communist attitudes toward the United States, that anyone who supposedly was communist could have children who were baptized Catholic and had been confirmed as Catholic, which was the case with his own children. And yet, even so, there were some elements in the church that, you know, were against them. I think certainly Cardinal Spellman was an example of that. And I think even in Brooklyn, which is where Paul was living in the 1930s until he moved, you know, across the river into over into Manhattan in the early 1940s. In Brooklyn during that time, there was kind of the community was very tight knit, but it was also to an extent tribal, and the Brooklyn Tablet was certainly very vocal in how they viewed anybody that I guess displayed even kind of a tinge of what might be considered, I suppose, sort of advocating for the rights of leftists and communists more at the fringe.
Okay. And how did he then get involved with the African American and civil rights movement?
Well, he jumped in. He had friends, you know, he was a figure on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which was liberal. He was a figure in what was called the Democratic Reform Movement, which was a wave of recent college graduates who were getting involved in politics and were, you know, opposed to the smoke-filled room of Tammany Hall, and really put the blade in Tammany, in the Greenwich Village. The group of Reform Democrats down there rallied to defeat Carmine DeSapio, the head of Tammany Hall, as their district leader, and that was beginning of the end of Tammany Hall. It's long reign, and not all negative, but to this group of young people, a negative kind of reign of Tammany Hall over New York and the Democratic organizations. So they were young Turks. Paul was already middle-aged, but joined in with them and actually was at the forefront of forming the early clubhouses with people like Eleanor Roosevelt that made up the constellation of Democratic Reform clubhouses around Manhattan and around the city. That group of people wanted the Democratic Party in New York to take on issues, and they were liberal and left, and they, of course, were very early, including the club that Paul belonged to on the Upper West Side, to oppose the Vietnam War. I think they were putting out resolutions as early as 1965 against the war. That's how Paul got involved with that. And alluding back to his disenchantment with British colonialism in general, he kind of viewed the American intervention in Southeast Asia as along the same line, kind of imperial hubris and immoral. So he had no problem joining with his comrades on the left, or as beginning in the early 60s in fighting the war. He emerges as a national spokesman against the war, somewhat improbably when he jumps in against two other candidates in 1968 to run for U.S. Senate. I can mention what happened there, but essentially he was not the Democratic machine's state machine's choice. They chose another candidate, and there was a third candidate and that candidate that the Democrats chose was named Gene Nickerson. He was a Nassau County leader, and he was with Bobby Kennedy. And another candidate emerged upstate who was a businessman who was named Joseph Resnick, who was with LBJ. Paul got the Democratic Reform people behind him, and he runs in that primary in 1968 as a strong ally of Eugene McCarthy, the Wisconsin Democratic senator, and was known as a peacenik or a dove, anti-war figure, against the ultimate nominee, who was Hubert Humphrey, the vice president of the United States under Lyndon Johnson. So Paul goes to the famous 1968 Democratic Convention, famous for being a tumultuous affair that divided the party. And he's a leader of the peace delegates who fight first to get a strong language into the Democratic Party plank unsuccessfully, and then to oppose Humphrey's nomination, in part because Humphrey had not appeared on a single primary ballot. He was simply anointed by LBJ, who, as you may remember, dropped out very abruptly that March. Convention was in August, but that March, after nearly losing the New Hampshire primary to this relative unknown Eugene McCarthy. So it was a real scrambled affair and very contentious. Paul himself remember getting pushed around. A lot of people on the floor were being pushed around. Mayor Daley of Chicago was running the show both inside the hall and out on the streets, where the anti-war movement, mostly students, were mobilized to resist. And they clashed with the city police, and it was a bloody affair. Paul led the delegates out of the convention hall after Humphrey's nomination and into the streets. They were holding candles, and it was a peace march to line himself up with the peace movement that he'd always been with. And then he goes back to New York to continue campaigning for Senate, and he is the candidate of the youth who are against the war, that is. And so he had a national presence as an anti-war figure by 1968.
Okay.
And just to follow up a little bit more, I guess, in terms of, I think, civil rights, Paul got involved in the movement partly early on through involvement with litigation in terms of, I guess, a housing project, Stuyvesant Village, in the late 1940s. And he was on the side of those who wanted to integrate this project. And then kind of simultaneously with that, he developed, I guess, the first of a number of friendships with and alliances with politicians in the African-American community. And the most prominent one was his friend Percy Sutton. And they met at that time, and they really became great friends later on in life. And then, I guess, in the 1940s, he went down into the South and specifically to Mississippi to aid, I guess, activists who are helping in voter registration drives and in providing legal representation in a couple of cases for those activists. And then later on, and this is kind of an example, I think, of the way what Rob was saying before, he looked to, I guess, helping members of upcoming communities. He did become very involved later on in promoting, for instance, David Dinkins' rise in New York City politics. He also was involved with Congressman Rangel as well, and then I guess also there were judicial figures as well that he really looked toward promoting as well. So.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, I could say just a bit about his temperament. I know we've talked a lot about his politics and his journey from Ireland to America, and the substance of Paul and his seriousness. He was a serious guy who thought like a lawyer and had a spine, I would say, and acted courageously and consistently throughout his career. But he maintained friendships with people who were Republican, who were conservative, much more conservative with him. He had a bit of frustration with the younger generation of Irish and more recent immigrants who he felt were becoming disconnected from the problems in Ireland, and that he continued to maintain engagement with on many fronts as a kind of a coalition builder.
Mhm.
But he never really, he said this. He says, I never held it over anyone if they were more conservative than I was, or if they chose a different path. And he recognized his path was somewhat idiosyncratic for an Irish immigrant. He didn't change his views. He didn't mind the criticism, but he maintained, he had a great sense of humor, a very dry sense of humor. And we did, for this book, we did close to 100 interviews, I would say. And, whatever people thought of his politics, they just had a certain amount of love and respect came across for him in every sphere. I think it was because he had a captivating personality. He could be guileless and funny. And he seemed to just have a love for the Irish community and the Irish diaspora that everyone knew where he was coming from, even if they disagreed with him.
Mhm. Well, that brings me on, and I should at this point say, if those of you who are listening, if you want to, ask a question, you can utilize the Q&A or the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. So talk to me a little bit about his support for Irish independence and a united Ireland. I suppose, he kind of fails to what should I say, criticize, the IRA, or he doesn't distance himself, from the violence that's happening. How is he trying to get involved? I'm talking now in the 70s and 80s when it was, the hard times, and then nearly kind of comes full circle to encourage Bill Clinton to, recognize what's his face, Jerry Adams, and then get involved in the Good Friday Agreement talks.
Well, I think, first of all, as far as the violence was concerned, his primary focus was really on the depredations visited on Northern Ireland by Britain, the British government, and that took the form of, I guess, housing discrimination, gerrymandering, and he actually, at one point, and this was really very unusual in the late 1970s, at a point when many others in the Irish nationalist community weren't even thinking of it, but he reached out to a Protestant paramilitary leader, Andy Tyree, to see if they could, I guess, get common ground on, I guess, issues where they both could just see matters over and above their particular communities, such as some of the issues that I just mentioned now. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect of this is that Paul really developed his advocacy on multiple fronts and multiple decades. And so certainly representing, I guess, NORAID was probably the most publicized aspect of it, as well as, I guess, those accused of gun running, as with the Fort Worth 5 case in 1972. But he was also involved in, I guess, creating, I guess, a whole phalanx, if you will, of younger people who could carry on after him. Wow. So he set up the Brehon Law Society that would advocate for, I guess, rights of many of these people, and he also pursued, even from the point of view of getting, I guess, more of a media presence for Irish Americans. Remember, especially in the 1970s and well into the 1980s, that much of what the American media was hearing about Northern Ireland was filtered through British politicians and British media. Mm-hmm. So at one point, Paul set in motion, I guess, a process where at a time when the New York Times and the Associated Press had no bureaus in Northern Ireland to speak of, but he managed to get a fellowship set in process where a journalist could get a fellowship to report on the ground from there and see what was happening. And he also, I guess, looked to try to, I guess, organize protests, for instance, against the New York Times and how they were really misreporting the situation in Northern Ireland, basically taking scraps of information from, I guess, British officials and British media. So I think multiple fronts, and the one last one was actually seeking out other politicians, and including those from different groups and even different philosophies than would ever come into play. So we were talking a little bit about the African American community, and one person that Paul ended up endorsing for president was Jesse Jackson. And key to that endorsement was Jackson's support of the McBride principles in the 1980s. So,
yeah. So we've just had a question from Catherine. Did Paul ever have interactions with John Hume, especially in the 1970s and 80s when Hume was in the US a lot, to push for constitutional methods to solve the Northern Irish issue?
Mike, you want to take that, or do you want
I'm just going to take myself off camera so I can move rooms without making everybody seasick. I just begin my laptop.
I think John, I don't know if they ever met, but John Hume was, I think, more involved with politicians like the so-called Four Horsemen, meaning, I guess, you carry Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Tip O'Neill. So I think they were kind of the primary people that I guess John Hume was sort of dealing with. I think Paul certainly made it a point to try to get, I guess, the entire spectrum of groups that were involved in Northern Ireland, from the loyalist / unionist side of the spectrum all the way over to the nationalists. But I don't know that he had really if he ever actually met or communicated to any great degree with John Hume.
Yeah, the politics, of course, is so extremely complicated.
Yeah.
And I don't claim to fully understand it, not having been at the table or followed it extremely closely at the time. But I did follow it, but not with the kind of care, I guess, and forensic attention it might have required to understand it. But Paul kind of went his own way. He was a coalition builder, and he formed his own groups. And he was very focused on the issue of Jerry Adams, and Hume and Adams were not on the same page until I think later. And he knew Adams, and he wanted the U.S. to get involved, to intervene as a broker. And had been historically great resistance to interfering with its special alliance with Great Britain. Quite advanced in years, he was key to, with his son Brian and his circle of kind of grassroots people. He was key to getting Bill Clinton, then a candidate in the Democratic primary in New York, to the table, to an event at the Sheraton, where he was asked a number of questions by Irish activists and leaders, and Paul sat in the front row. Bill shook his hand, knew him, and probably on some level felt comfortable enough to go before this group 2 days before the New York primary vote to give them answers to their scripted questions, which included, yes, I support giving Jerry Adams a 2-day visa, and yes, I think there should be a U.S. envoy appointed. And Neil O'Dowd, the publisher of the Irish Voice, who would become very involved, kind of behind the scenes in the negotiations in Northern Ireland later on, he said that Paul practically punched the ceiling. He was just he'd never seen an American politician running at that level who seemed to have the understanding of what needed to be done, and of the Irish experience. And he got kind of frustrated later. There were delays, as you might expect, once Clinton was elected. But when Clinton made those decisions and carried through on the promises he made that night at the Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, a lot of people remembered Paul and how he shepherded that along with Clinton and in all of his activities going back decades.
So to wrap it up for me, and again, I'll encourage anyone who's watching to, put your question in the chat or the Q&A. He was successfully ran a couple of times for city council, but he had unsuccessful bids kind of at the state or national level. Do you think he was too sort of quintessentially a New Yorker and a Manhattanite, maybe, for his appeal to, because he was, I won't say contradictory, but he had a wide tent, he had a big tent in terms of the LGBTQ stuff as well, like he wasn't quite Catholic enough, he mightn't have been quite left enough. There would have been disagreements over Israel. By this stage, we've had the Nakba in 1948. So, he had many causes, but maybe some of them were contradicting each other in the eyes of potential voters.
there's an element to that, and I think there were some other aspects of his temperament and of the situation at the time that really militated against the kind of success in politics, for instance, that his brother Bill had. I think one aspect of it in many of his campaigns, and certainly in a campaign he had running in 1970 for the Senate, where he was beaten in the primary by Richard Ottinger. And he was certainly outspent. I think many of his opponents in other campaigns just had larger war chests, and that was not only in general elections, but also in primaries. I think temperamentally, Paul really felt himself more drawn toward the law than politics. I mean, in a way, I liken it a little bit to Frank Sinatra's respective talents as a singer and an actor. I think Sinatra certainly had great talent as an actor, but his heart and soul was in singing. I think Paul's heart and soul was in the law. And another aspect of it was he just, from the point of view of basically how he felt about the whole process, he wasn't really as invested in it emotionally as certainly other people were. One of his sons told us in an interview that after the elections were over, Paul basically put it out of his mind. He never really held any kind of grudges against any of his opponents, for instance, whereas his wife Kathleen certainly did, which I found pretty amusing in its way. And I think at one point too, in I guess one of his later campaigns, they had I guess a subway appearance for Paul, and Paul was shaking everyone's hands for about, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes, and then he was suddenly said to an aide, you know, I think it's time for to go for some coffee, and and he missed this whole opportunity to meet and greet other people. So yeah, so I think it's partly a matter of circumstance and partly a matter of character for him, you know, that militated against his success in politics.
To which I might add also, Mike, and I agree with everything you said, he was also drawn to social movements, right? And so he was, and as I pointed out, he was, to be a social movement activist and a politician is a hard line to walk. Paul walked it by being very consistent. And so you might call him stubborn. He did not bend his beliefs to win elections. He did not hold back. And that is not necessarily a characteristic that helps you win if you're not, you know, you could ask Bill Clinton, if you're not willing to compromise along the way, you might offend more people than you gain by being consistent. So that was Paul, and he wasn't a natural born crowd pleaser or political accommodationist at times as his brother, in order to you know, work in a complicated system that requires compromise. Yeah.
Which is, you know, probably a compliment to him in one way, you know, that he wasn't playing those games, or it didn't come down to lobbyists.
I mean, even in that 1948 race I was describing up in Inwood, he leaves the campaign trail pretty close to the election to help out some striking workers downtown. And he commented afterward that he was surprised by how close he came to Javits in that election that he lost. And maybe if he hadn't run off to to help striking workers, which is where his heart will lay, he might have been able to pull it off. And Javits would have been, running for the bus, he said, instead of running for re-election.
Lovely. And we'd have a center called after him. Just guys, in the process of the research and writing a book together, did you divide up certain chapters, or, did you combine? How did you actually co-author a book?
Good question. A lot of the research we did, by the way, was during the COVID pandemic, which I guess perversely helped, because we had a captive audience when we picked up the phone and called people, and they had nowhere they could go. So they had to sit and listen to our questions and even answer a few of them. So that was good. Mike is an extraordinarily wonderful person to work with, a huge talent as an editor, as a writer, and just as an historian, and also as someone who can navigate through archives and find information. And Paul's information was spread very widely, right? In his papers, in clips, and in these interviews, and in other sources. So we had to really cast a wide net and then organize the chapters. We divvied up the chapters essentially, and then we would swap them and then we would put on the cap of editor for each other. And that's how
good.
Collaboration went. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess for my part, I think that, and it really has been true since I first got to know Rob when we were classmates in college many years ago. He's just an extremely fluid writer who can also write rapidly. And that's a terrific talent. And at the same time, he certainly developed a great many contacts during his time when he was covering politics that we were able to call upon when we needed to find further sources on this. So,
well, that's
but
great.
I could be cranky.
Well, can't we all?
Just ask my kids.
So if there aren't any more questions, I'll just review again. The book is called An Irish Passion for Justice, The Life of Rebel New York Attorney Paul O'Dwyer. It's by Robert Polner and Michael Tubridy. It is, of course, there you have it. Yeah, it's available online, or it's an ebook as well as a hardback at the moment. Cornell University Press has printed it, and so we will probably get copies at the museum up in Albany for our members up there. I'll try and organize some into the society, but of course in the meantime you can buy it at your local bookstore or that body online that we try not to talk about. But it is available at all book retailers. Bernadette says thank you very much for a great discussion. I'll read it soon. Catherine as well. Yeah, so thanks guys, that was fantastic. We're delighted to have had you on.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
It was fascinating, and he is such a fascinating character, I think, for both New York, and the wider our wider heritage. So we are back with a talk in the Society on the 5th. We're doing, what are we doing? Sing, John Millington Sing, that's live in the Society, and we're both back online on Monday the 10th with a discussion with an Irish historian about Liam Lynch and the Irish War of Independence. So keep an eye on both Facebooks and websites and all that. Regina said she didn't know much about him. Jeff, very interesting. Thank you. Looking forward to your books. So thanks, guys. That was fantastic. Have a great evening, and we'll have you back again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
Not at all. Love you.